I did a philosophy degree to begin with, so I was lucky enough to study philosophy at Durham. It was a really interesting and really amazing course to have been on, and I think even though I didn't end up doing anything with it, and it was one of those bizarre degrees that you can't really utilise in real life, I do feel like a lot of the sort of the thought processes and the way that we kind of looked at things definitely inform my practice, even to this day. So a lot of that does definitely suffuse my photographic work. Down the line, I decided to retrain at a law firm. And I decided that I wasn't particularly happy doing that, and I decided to retrain and do a photography degree. So I was accepted onto the BA Hons at Batley School of Art, which was really amazing. And obviously, like, from there on, I realised how much I absolutely loved photography as a medium, so that was cool. And I've just finished my MFA at Ulster, which was amazing as well. Such a great group of people, some of whom I can see are on the chat. So really lucky to have been able to study alongside those guys, and made some really interesting work, which definitely pushed me outside my comfort zone. So from sort of like my Instagram and from my background, you may be able to see that I'm predominantly a practicing fashion photographer. So to do an MFA has really opened up my perspective on how to sort of conceptually underpin work. It's really been a massive leg up, I think, for me in terms of my photographic work. So in the first year of my MA, I started off thinking about what issues were really important to me and what sort of work I expected other people to work and what I expected of myself. And I think from a personal perspective, I wanted to look into the trans experience, what it was to be and what it is to be trans today, and particularly in the North, because I am from the North. It's very much a different kind of culture up here. A lot of the trans individuals that I did speak to said that they'd specifically gravitated from Scotland, Ireland, all over, just to be part of the northern trans community because it's so welcoming and so friendly. So I wanted to look at it from that perspective. So I was actually for this commissioned by Dazed, and I spent about 6 months just going out and meeting sort of like trans creatives in the North, going and chatting to them for ages, drinking lots of cups of tea with them, and then taking photos. So I was super lucky that those guys allowed me to collaborate with them and to create these images. I really enjoyed that, and I found it like super informative and sometimes heartbreaking. I found it uplifting, and I also found a really welcome, sort of like amazing community of people that were really trying to sort of unite this really fractured kind of country, the state that the country was in. There's definitely something to be said for a smaller, like, niche community like that. So I did quite a lot of work with people that were transitioning, some in different forms. So some were a little bit more advanced with this, some were only just beginning their transition. Some people had had full surgery. So this individual, as you can see from the scar here, had had a full phalloplasty. So I kind of looked at this image and I did think to myself when I was doing my research into the project, I kind of thought to myself, like, this is a very visceral image. Like, I look at it and I feel like something in my stomach and not. And you kind of at once feel like how much they've been through and sort of like how much the idea of transitioning does motivate them physically, as well as emotionally, to make that sort of surgical leap, really. I kind of wanted to progress after I'd done this project, though, because I thought to myself, when I was looking at that picture, why is it that we as photographers or artists wish to focus primarily on the physicality of the transition of the trans experience. And as I started to sort of think more in depth and to break it down, I kind of thought, I think what we need as humans is we need to see things to be able to know them and to understand them. So I wanted to look at why seeing, and as such knowing, held such import and does hold such import for us as a society. I wanted to look at and address that inherent power that we derive from seeing and from knowing and from possessing. And I kind of writing on how photography can be sort of proprietorial, in effect a sort of mode of apprehension. So kind of like having a photograph, like we can't own a huge multi-million-pound building, but we can own a photograph of it. We can't own a Picasso, but we can have a photo of it. And even down to sort of like the modes by which we capture images. So for like identification and for mugshots and that sort of thing. As I dug, I did find that photography was like inherently linked with that sense of appropriation, basically. So I started off doing some work with Mika, who was one of the trans guys that I'd photographed before, and he was so like generous and kind and patient in letting me just kind of like follow him around and like turn up at his house. He works like a night shift as well, so bless him, like I'd turn up in sort of like the late morning to mid-afternoon and he'd be asleep in bed. But he did let me document and kind of capture a lot of really important and integral moments in his life. So like the top left is where he was attacked. The bottom left is a picture that Mika shot himself. So I gave Mika, we wanted this to be quite collaborative and quite participatory. So I gave Mika a disposable camera and just asked him to shoot things that made him sort of like feel and the things that stirred him. And this is a picture of his boyfriend Luke from when they went away. So when I got the film developed, I had some really beautiful images to work with and some really interesting stuff, which was amazing. So as I kind of like continued on with the project, there was like a ton of research that I did, and I wanted to look at how the trans body could be regarded as a site of cultural resistance. So the first bit of research that I did, I looked into like phenomenology, and I looked into the mind-body paradox, so the sort of like the divide that's always been in place traditionally. I looked into that and I found that philosophers since Descartes had actually sort of sought to recouple the mind and body, and Bordeaux said the body is in the social world, but the social world is also in the body. So I found that really interesting. It was a really interesting starting place. Sordas also asserted that the body was the existential ground of culture and self. So I just took those sort of like essays that those guys wrote, and I kind of riffed a little bit on how the body could be perceived as being something malleable and something subjective. So obviously physically it's a body, but metaphysically, like the idea that it could be manipulated and that it could be changed and it could be subject to change, subject to opinions and perspectives, was something that was really interesting to me. So it was through that I ended up finding Foucault and Discipline and Punish. So Foucault did a whole book on the idea of how bodies are sort of obedient, and how the body is an object and a target of power. The body that is manipulated, shaped, trained, which obeys and responds. So I don't know if anybody's familiar with the panopticon. So I did a lot of reading into that, the Jeremy Bentham prison. So it's super interesting. It's kind of like prisoners were punished and they were sort of kept in order by constantly being aware that they were watched. So whether or not they were actually being watched, they shaped their behaviour in line with the idea that they were being observed. So that was something that really fed into things, and the idea of visibility and power and having power over people. So as a result of the work that I did on the body, I kind of came to the conclusion that a trans body, as opposed to sort of like a cis body, is a site of irrefutable resistance, being deviant, transgressive, and subject to greater control and censorship. So a lot of the research that I did kind of lent itself to the idea that the trans body was very much a subversive thing, and it did definitely sort of subvert a lot of like the traditional ideas of what it is to be human. The idea that although we are being watched, they don't necessarily sort of respond in kind. In fact, sometimes trans individuals do respond rather than we would. They respond to sort of provoke and to elicit some sort of like confusion, maybe even. They're like, I think there's sometimes people that like to kind of rise up really and sort of say, I'm not going to look a certain way or be a certain binary just because that's what you feel comfortable with. So I think it's the unknowable quality of the trans body that strips us, the observer, of our power. So if we see somebody, if they're passing, we don't know whether they're male or female, and I think that unsettles us on some level. So I also found some writing by Purdy who said, for instance, if we go back to a basic concept of power over, then we see that in order for one actor to have power over another, there must be some knowledge of the individual over whom power is had, or else the power relationship may not exist. So I think for that intents and purposes, the trans body can often be very subversive in that we don't have power over them because we can't understand or recognise whether they are male or female just by looking at them. There's a lot going on under the surface that's unseen. And I think that kind of unseen element was what most interested me about the transition. So a lot of the transition that people are going through isn't necessarily physical, it's also sort of a spiritual or emotional journey, and it's not something that happens overnight, it's something that has been going on since birth for a lot of these people. So I started making work, and with me I did lots and lots of different sort of shoots. I did lots of documenting him. I did some stuff in the studio. We went out, we spent time together, we went for coffees, we chatted. He gave me lots of pages from his journal. He's an artist, so there was lots of amazing illustrations and drawings, poetry, all of which I kind of like fed back into compiling the book that I eventually came to make. And this particular image, the words are from his journal and his feelings and thoughts, and the image that I've juxtaposed with his image on the right is of my own son, who is biologically male. So in this, I'm trying to get the audience to question authenticity, the idea that a photograph often is taken as being authentication of something. I looked quite a lot into sort of like the ontology of photography and found that people invest a lot of veracity in a photograph, you know, so seeing is believing, like a photograph is a document, but in many cases it can be, again, like the body subject to perception and subject to manipulation from whoever's seeing it through whatever gaze they're looking at it. So that was one where I tried to sort of examine the idea of authenticity and the idea of being biological or non-biologically male. So just in terms of like a rationale, just to qualify what I said before, Mika and many trans and non-gender conforming persons, by shaping themselves outside of the usual cultural constraints of gender, could be said to be resisting the hegemonic power regimes. So by this token, Mika, I feel, is in turn shaping society at large. So even just by working with me and by educating me and talking to me, he evokes change in others, and that spreads, you know, like every conversation that he has where he educates somebody as to how he wants to be addressed, how he wants to be looked at, how he wants to be sort of labelled in terms of his pronouns. It's kind of shaping society at large rather than just sort of remaining like in a small knot of community where, you know, there's not many people interacting with them. So the work really, I think if I was to say what it really centres on, I would say that it's visibility and that paradoxical relationship that visibility has with power. So I sort of touched upon before the idea of trans people passing. So by passing, I mean, you know, if I was transitioning to a man, if I walked down the street or if I went into a shop and people thought I was a man, biologically a man, then I would be passing. So for a lot of trans people, the desire to pass is an overriding objective. Of course, like, you know, the idea of being trans, it's inherently coupled with violence and fear and that sort of lack of understanding that kind of puts people on the back foot and frightens people somewhat. So passing is actually something that's super important for a lot of trans people for their own safety. But there are people like Mika who deliberately provoke, I think, with a sort of refusal to conform to gender archetypes. So for Mika looks ostensibly female in some regards, the way that he dresses, you know, with sort of like bras and bodices and long nails and makeup could be perceived to be sort of like, you know, traditionally female. However, he is male, he does identify as male. And if anybody does come up to him and start speaking to him and misgenders him, he will be really quick to correct them. So it's a really interesting one with Mika, and I think he has always been and he always will be just a really interesting person, quite a paradoxical person for certain. So the idea of being seen or unseen or constructed visibility, as Foucault would have it, does centre on this power, and it kind of relates to whether the knowledge is given freely or taken. So I think with Mika, the idea that he gives the knowledge freely that he is trans is quite an interesting one, because it does seem to fly in the face of his appearance at times. So the work is called The Yellow Steps, put it together into a book. I got a lot of images and I decided to make them into a book. It represents my attempt, and I think he'd probably agree to his attempts to elicit a politicised gaze. So I think whenever you're looking at a trans individual, a person of colour, it's always going to be a politicised gaze. I wanted it to polarise though, I wanted it to divide, and I wanted people to say, you know, who is this? And when they learned that he was trans, to be like, oh, okay. I wanted it to sort of reveal to us our own limitations and the extent of our own tolerance and what our understanding is. And I think looking at images that make us kind of question what the authenticity is, whether it be gender or anything else, I think are really interesting. I also use architecture quite a bit in the work. Again, that relates to Foucault, and I wanted to sort of tie it in with the idea of it being a construct, much like gender is a construct, societally speaking. So like the architecture worth reference in the work, our constructs should be more than representations. They should be an insight into who we are as a culture and who we wish to be. So just go on. So I have a video here of what the flow of the book should be like. Sorry, it's a bit wobbly. My apologies. I did decide on it being a book because I thought that transition is more sort of like a continuum as opposed to just like a few sort of static moments frozen in time. I wanted it to flow. And when I do get the book sorted, it will be quite interactive as well. I'm going to have like inserts and different images that can be moved around and shaped dependent on how you choose to view it, essentially. It's difficult to see as well, but there are, the words are sort of like taken from interviews with him, from audio that I've transcribed, some of his poems and that sort of thing. So that is how it should theoretically flow. So yeah, I just thought to kind of like level up with the artist statement. So the yellow steps navigates with notions of visibility and change. So primarily how the construct of gender is determined by what is visible. The work is a conceit for the way in which the trans body acts in opposition to this trope and moreover as a site of cultural resistance. The project is a collaboration between myself and Miko, a trans boy. I allowed him to build and actively participate in a narrative of his own construction. The title of the project is actually taken from his poem, The Yellow Steps, where he describes a piece of architecture that he used to go to when he was younger, when his family were arguing and when there was sort of like trouble at home. He used to sort of see it as being a bit of an escape, but also he felt that there was something sinister and something quite sickening and sickly about the colour of the steps. So as I mentioned before, architecture is used throughout to echo this sense of construction, and I've focused quite a lot on architecture that is undergoing change. So pieces that are under construction are often shrouded with tarpaulin. It's a strange thing that we have in our culture that we want to conceal and that we want to sort of obstruct the eye from seeing a change being undergone. And the more I noticed it, the more I noticed it. So like shop fronts with like kind of like, you know, paint over them or papered, and building sites and construction sites with tarpaulin and sort of tatty raggedy cloth to kind of obstruct our view of the change that was undergoing underneath. So I found that really interesting. So the work is specifically sort of like designed to begin with lots of images of Mika, but not really being able to see him fully, it being quite sort of like hidden. So the work is kind of a measured realization. So we initially begin with Mika being quite hidden, and he's gradually revealed towards the end, where we see one image of him sort of like fully facing the camera. I think the reason that I chose to do this was because I wanted it to be a sort of process of revelation, to be able to sort of see it evolve, essentially, much like a transition in itself. So like the idea of passing in society being born of necessity, other people like Mika refuse to conform to gender archetypes just to make other people feel comfortable. The yellow steps centres on this dichotomy, so the sort of Foucauldian theory of power amassed by surveillance in order, in particular on and over architectural spaces in the body. So again, I'm just solidifying the idea that the work explores visibility and its relationship with power. So what I kind of want out of this is for the audience to sort of question the act of looking as a site of power, revealing the layers of identity making that are disclosed not only in the construction of the trans subject, but in ourselves as well. So I kind of want us to question Mika and to question our ideas of what a male should be like, or what a female should be like, how they should dress, how they should act. And I want us to look inside ourselves and sort of see where the problems are with that, and see how we kind of constrain ourselves, really. So that's it, really. I've gone on for quite a long time there. Hopefully you guys will have some questions for me, but nothing too tricky, I hope. But thanks very much for listening.
Yeah, folks, if you have any questions, you can unmute yourself now and just ask a question if you have one. Any takers?
I think I've bored everybody into oblivion there. Everyone's just like sleeping.
Let me see. Oh, here we go. Let me see. Maybe I've switched something on that they can't unmute. Oh, here we go.
I'll stop sharing my screen as well now so that I can face-to-face chat to people.
There's some people unmuting, but nobody's asking a question. Here we go. We have a question here. Thanks. Or I'll ask a question here what somebody's put up on our chat. It's from Aoife, and she's asking, has Micah seen the book, and what does he think of it?
Yeah, so right from sort of square one, we've worked really closely together. So when I've done like mock-ups and dummies, I've always taken it to him to show him. I have to be really careful though, obviously, like I don't want to, he talks really candidly about his mum. So when he first came out as trans to his mum basically just said, "You're dead to me, like I've lost a child." She couldn't handle it at all. She was just unable to get past her own feelings of loss. So there's a lot of bits in the book, lots of dialogue where he talks about that. And, you know, he said to me that he really wants a copy of the book. And I said, I'll do a copy of the book, but what I'll do is I'll do sort of like a special one without the text in it, because I don't want your mum to see it and to get upset. So yeah, he really liked the book and the various sort of iterations of it, but he really liked the end when he said that it'd come together really nicely. And he was really interested to see how it had panned out, because obviously so meant like the amount of times we've been and met each other and chatted and like been to pubs and like been to coffee shops and like I've hung out at his house, so like billions of photographs, but sort of like all potted into something that I hope runs along a kind of narrative, this sense of like concealment towards revelation. But yeah, he said that he really liked it. That's cool. I was super nervous to show him, actually. I was really nervous because a lot of it is like him facing away from the camera, and you know, not everybody would appreciate that, I guess, but I think because he's an artist, he completely understood what I was trying to do, and he really did offer a lot and a lot of input and stuff. So I think, yeah, it was definitely like a bit of a meeting of minds in the end, if that makes sense.
Yes, very good. That was yeah, it's always a positive when your subject does like what you're doing.
Yeah, I was really nervous, actually. Yeah, I was really nervous to show him, but yeah, he said he liked it, so that was like, phew.
Right, let's see. Does anybody else want to ask any questions here?
Yeah, I was wondering, is this the first time you've collaborated like this?
Yeah, it is. So, oh, my cat's just getting in on the action now. That
Oh, I've got one in front of me now as well.
Hi, Maud. Yeah, it was. So I definitely think that I was a little bit inspired. We went with our MFA. We went along to Martin Parr Foundation, and Julian Germain was there, and he was telling us about some amazing participatory art that he'd been sort of like doing with some guys in like the favelas in Brazil. And I'd already had like a bit of a seed of it in my mind. So from the outset, I definitely knew that I wanted to kind of relinquish a lot of control, really, and give it up to Mika. I think with it being such a sensitive subject, I was really conscious that I didn't want to be exploitative. I didn't want to just like take pictures of a trans person. I wanted like a ton of his voice to come through, and I wanted him to like kind of help construct this sort of narrative, really, rather than it just being me pointing a camera at him and telling him to perform, sort of thing. But yeah, I've not really done anything like that before, and I found it really interesting. I think if he wasn't such an amazing person, and if he wasn't so talented and so like, he's very like aesthetic himself, like it might not have turned out the way that it did. But I just think, yeah, like with anybody else, it might not have been as successful as I think it ended up being. But I did really enjoy it, and I would definitely do it again, like given the right opportunity and the right person. But like, it was just really amazing spending time with him. Like, I do really love him as a person. I think like I hope it shows anyway.
Yeah, I think it does. I think it's quite sensitive, and I like the fact that it's not sort of straight on as well, because it's that thing of I mean, I'm really interested in perception, for instance, and it's, you know, you can see someone fall. Everyone has a different perception of that person, you know. So I think it really illustrates that really nicely.
Yeah, like I think the idea of, yeah, like 100 different people could look at that and interpret it in a different way. But I think, you know, people that have looked at it in the past have said that it feels quite playful, and it feels that we had, you know, you can see the relationship that sort of was burgeoning as it progressed. But yeah, I'm glad that you said sensitive, because I did think I do have to be really careful with how I handle it. So thanks very much for that.
You're welcome. You did it.
Thank you.
I'd be interested to see any more sort of collaborations you do. Do you think maybe you'd collaborate with more than one person in a sort of group thing?
Yeah, definitely. I think it'd be really interesting, actually. There's definitely like a little bit of a thought that I've got brewing in my head. So my eldest is trans, and their friendship group, there's a couple of sort of trans and non-gender conforming people in there. Yeah. So I was thinking it could potentially be quite an interesting project. And yeah, just basically giving people cameras and just getting people to shoot each other and to sort of like tell me and tell everybody who would care to look what their life is made up of. I just think like we don't get to see that, and teenagers generally, it's kind of like it's very much unseen, isn't it, the stuff that they get up to and the way that they see the world. It's such a fleeting sort of like period in your life, and I think being able to peep into that would be amazing. So it's definitely definitely a process that I think really opens up a lot of opportunities that I wouldn't probably be privy to, and that a lot of us wouldn't be privy to otherwise. So yeah, definitely want to do something like that going forward.
Yeah, that'd be great. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you, Poppy. Connor has asked a question here. Do you plan to continue working on the project, and if so, how do you see it progressing?
Yeah, so I think Mika's probably absolutely sick of the sight of me by now. He works really hard. He works like a long sort of like night shift, and it became, towards the end, it was getting really tricky to sort of like pin him down to be able to meet up with him. He also does sex work as well, so there was that. It was really difficult trying to kind of like get some quality time with him. So I think towards the end, he definitely was looking forward to a close. So I probably wouldn't continue working with Mika, although I will 100% keep in touch with him, just like as friends. But yeah, I think, yeah, I definitely would like to, like I was just saying to Poppy, maybe continue on with the idea of like what it is to be trans, and like the new generation of trans individuals, it's so different now. Like it's such a different world. It's a lot more sort of like acceptable and a lot more common. I mean, I don't know about you guys, but when I was at school, like I hadn't even heard of the idea of what a trans person would be. And it's only been sort of like in recent years that it's become more and more prevalent. And I think now societally there's quite a substantial amount of people, you know. I think it used to be that like maybe I think it was like 3% of people, of men, like identified as being trans or something like that, a tiny amount. And I think it's risen exponentially. Apparently in the last 3 years the NHS has reported that girls wanting to transition to be regarded as boys has gone up by 4,000% in the last 3 years. So it's a massive like cultural phenomenon that's it's really changing like society. It's really interesting. So like I do definitely want to kind of keep looking at that and keep digging into what it means for future generations, and particularly for this generation now, because we're living in quite an odd time, quite a fractious time when people are definitely sort of like wary of otherness and fearful, and obviously like there's still quite a lot of hate and a lot of people that are trying to incite that. So I think it's something that I definitely want to dig into and keep going. But definitely I think I'm going to give Mika a bit of respite, bless him. Sick to the back teeth of me, I think, by the end of it. If that answers your question at all.
Yeah, thank you very much. That's I'm sure that covers the questions. Does anybody else have one more? We'll take one more question if we have one. Silence. Okay, thank you, Xanthe. That was a great talk. Very interesting. And you're getting, if you look at your chat, you're getting all the thank yous there coming up.
Thank you. Thanks very much.
Of everybody who's been listening. Yes, we just would like to thank you again just for doing this for us, and it's been very informative.
Thanks so much for listening to me, guys. Thanks for tuning in, and I hope that made sense, because I'm not sure whether it did, but
hopefully it did. And thank you, Maud.
Yes, she says you're welcome.